Switzerland, December 1913. A 38-year-old man lies down on his office floor, closes his eyes, and deliberately decides to let his mind sink. He is not sleeping. He is not meditating. He is doing something that has no name, yet a voluntary descent into the depths of his own psyche, into a territory he describes in his journals as dark, bottomless, and inhabited by figures that speak in voices that are not his own. For the next 6 years, he will make this descent every night. He will encounter a wise old man who teaches him things he never knew. He will witness visions of blood flooding Europe that, 3 months later, became the First World War. He will record everything in a handwritten, hand-illustrated book that he kept hidden for 95 years. When it was finally published in 2009, no one could say with certainty whether they were reading the most important document in the history of psychology, or the diary of a man on the edge of madness. What you are about to hear is not the simplified story of the rebellious disciple who betrayed Freud. That version exists because it is easier to turn an intellectual break into a personal drama. But what really happened between Freud and Jung was something far more dangerous. Two men attempting to map the invisible forces that shape the human mind. Jung decided to go further than any of his contemporaries, and what he found at the bottom of his own psyche permanently changed the way the 20th century came to understand myth, religion, and creativity. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now and hit the bell. Because once you understand how far Jung truly went in that exploration, the way you look at your own mind may never be the same. There are words that everyone uses without knowing where they came from. Introvert, extrovert, archetype, collective, unconscious, synchronicity, persona shadow. These words entered the everyday language of the 20th century so naturally that most people never stopped to consider that each one of them was coined or developed by a single man, a Swiss physician who worked in a psychiatric hospital, who broke with the most famous mentor of his era, and who then spent 6 years deliberately descending into the darkest territory of his own mind. Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875 in Switzerland, the son of a Protestant minister who quietly doubted the faith he preached, and a mother who had 2 distinct personalities, one daytime and conventional, the other nocturnal and oracular, surfacing in states that deeply unsettled the young Carl. This childhood caught between the institutional faith of a father who no longer believed and the psychic strangeness of a mother who seemed to see things prepared Jung for the work that would define his life in ways no academic path could ever have planned. Jung studied medicine. He specialized in psychiatry. He found Freud. He was chosen as the heir to the psychoanalytic movement. And then he destroyed all of it, to descend into the abyss he had been studying in others and recognized as his own. Over the next 80 minutes, you will follow that descent. You will understand what he found down there, and you will understand why the map he drew remains the most honest one we have of the territory we all inhabit, but that almost no one wants to look at directly. But before we enter his life, I need to put a question to you that psychology textbooks rarely ask out loud. Jung spent 6 years deliberately communicating with figures from his own unconscious figures with their own names, their own opinions, figures that told him things he genuinely considered wise. There were 2 names for what he was doing. The name psychiatrists would use to describe the same behavior in a patient was psychosis. The name Jung used for himself was confrontation with the unconscious. What separates the 2? The answer is the foundation of everything Jung. Imagine. growing up in a Swiss parsonage in the last quarter of the 19th century. The house sits in Kleinhunningen, a village near Basel that the 20th century had not yet fully touched. Open fields, the smell of the Rhine nearby, winters of a grey that is not merely meteorological but existential, the particular quality of silence that settles over places where people have lived for generations without ever questioning why they live there. The father is a Protestant minister, learned, melancholic, with a library of Oriental philology that young Karl explores in secret. A library that opens up a universe of theological and philosophical questions that Sunday school never touches. He is a good man. He is also a man who has lost his faith without being able to admit it, who preaches what he no longer believes with a sadness his son watches and never forgets. When young Karl asks him direct questions about God, the father answers with an anxiety that says more than any theology could. There is a wound in the father that institutional faith cannot heal, and that his son will inherit, transformed. The mother is harder to describe. By day, Emily Jung is a conventional woman, sturdy, warm in her own way, without her husband's melancholy. By night, she is someone else. Jung described decades later a nocturnal presence that emerged from his mother in states we would now recognize as dissociative. A different voice, a different gaze, words that seemed to come from a place the everyday world never reached. It was not madness. It was something the village tolerated with the silent discomfort reserved for things it could not name. Young Karl watched closely. He was learning that the human mind had more layers than its visible surface suggested. He was learning that the people he loved most had interior territories he could not access. He was learning that the visible and the invisible coexisted in the same body, in the same house, on the same ordinary day. It was an education no university offered. Jung's childhood was solitary in a way he described as the product of choice as much as circumstance. There were few kids his age. There were many books. There was the natural world, the fields, the lake, the stones, with which Jung developed relationships of an intensity others would have found strange, but which felt entirely normal to him. And there was the dream. At around the age of 3, early enough that its origin predates clear verbal memory, Jung dreamed he was in a meadow when he discovered a hole in the ground. He descended. He found an underground chamber. At its center stood a stone throne. On the throne sat a figure that was simultaneously a tree and a living thing of flesh, enormous, motionless, crowned by something luminous. He woke up in a panic. He did not tell his mother right away. When he finally did, she told him it was the Manitou. The explanation did not help. Jung carried that dream for decades before he came to understand, or before he proposed an understanding of what it meant. When he finally wrote about it in memories, dreams, reflections in the last years of his life, he identified it as the first emergence of the collective unconscious in his individual experience, the first sign that inside the 3-year-old boy there was a territory belonging to something larger than the specific child who inhabited it. He may have been right. He may have been projecting theory backward onto memory. What is certain is that the dream was real, and the impression it left was permanent. Adolescence brought further disturbances. There was the question of personality, number 2. The growing conviction that the everyday young Karl, the schoolboy, the pastor's son, was a layer over something older and more essential that occupied the same body but belonged to a different time. This feeling was not dissociation in the clinical sense. Jung functioned normally, studied, had friendships. It was more of a double awareness he observed with curiosity rather than fear. It was already the position of the analyst facing his own unconscious. When the time came to choose a field of study, Jung wavered between archaeology, history, philosophy, and the natural sciences, all of them appealing, none of them resolving the central question. The final decision was medicine, made after 2 consecutive nights of dreams he interpreted as inner direction. It was not the most obvious choice for a boy from a family without significant financial resources. It was the only one that made sense on the inside. In 1895, at age 20, Carl Gustav Jung enrolled at the University of Basel. He brought with him the underground dream, the double personality, and a still shapeless certainty that there was an interior territory the science of his time did not know how to map. He was going to learn the medicine available to him. And then he was There is a paradox at the heart of Jung's adolescence that biographers identify but rarely examine with the attention it deserves. The boy who would go on to construct the 20th century's most comprehensive psychological theory of the inner life was, on the outside, a perfectly functional student. He got good grades. He had friends. He participated in school life with a competence that raised no questions. Nothing visible from the outside suggested what was happening within. What was happening within was an inner life of an intensity and a strangeness that Jung spent decades trying to describe without ever feeling fully satisfied with his descriptions. The stone was the first public or semi-public sign of that strangeness. In the parsonage garden stood a large rock that Jung had a habit of sitting on. It was not simply a resting place. It was a place of a different quality, one where the double awareness he had identified in himself became sharper, where the question of identity formed itself with a clarity that ordinary daily life never produced. The question was this: when I am sitting on this stone, am I the one sitting on the stone, or am I the stone that someone is sitting on? Framed that way, it sounds like an abstract philosophical question any thoughtful teenager might have. For Jung, it was not abstract. It was visceral. It was the first articulation of something he would spend his life trying to name: the distinction between the self that acts and the self that observes, between the consciousness that identifies with the ego and the wider awareness that watches the ego from the outside. It was already the central problem of analytical psychology. Nobody around him recognized this. His father preached, his mother cooked and had her nocturnal presences. His classmates played, and Jung sat on the stone and wondered who was asking the question. School in Basel brought his first serious confrontation with the outside world. Jung was intelligent enough that his intelligence was visible in the way that evident talent sometimes provokes a particular reaction in peers. There was a bullying incident that escalated into a physical assault that left Jung with a concussion. What followed surprised everyone, including Jung himself. The concussion produced a series of fainting spells that doctors could find no organic explanation for. The episodes happened at school, on the way to school, in any situation that required returning to the social exposure that had preceded the attack. The pattern was recognizable: the body using illness as a way out of an unbearable situation. Jung knew this. He knew it and did not know it simultaneously. Consciousness number 2, observing the mechanism with a clarity that consciousness number 1 could not yet translate into action. He stayed home for months, away from school, with the forced freedom to read and think without the pressure of social performance. And then he overheard his father telling a friend, in a conversation not meant to be heard, that he feared for his son's future if the situation continued, that there were bills to pay, that Jung would need to work, that the illness was jeopardizing what he might become. Jung went to his study. He opened the books. He studied for 6 hours straight. He felt dizzy several times during the first sessions. He ignored it. The spells continued for a while longer and then disappeared completely. They never came back. It was, he recognized decades later, his first direct experience with what he would call the function of the unconscious, the way the psyche uses symptoms to communicate what consciousness cannot formulate directly, and how consciousness can respond to the symptom without eliminating what produced it, simply making the indirect form of communication unnecessary. The teenage Jung had done spontaneously what psychotherapy would later try to teach methodically. The years that followed were ones of quiet preparation. Philosophy, Schopenhauer, whom Jung discovered in his father's library and described as the first thinker who had spoken honestly about suffering without disguising it as cheap optimism. Kant, who raised questions about the limits of knowledge that contemporary science arrogantly ignored. And Nietzsche, whose thus spoke Zarathustra Jung read at 18 with an identification that disturbed him deeply, recognizing in the text someone who had descended into the same territory he himself sensed existed, but who had made that descent without the map that Jung did not yet have but felt certain it was possible to draw. The decision to study medicine in 1895 was, in that context, less a professional choice than a methodological bet. Medical science had instruments. It had precision. It had an empirical discipline that philosophy could not offer. If there was an interior territory that needed to be mapped, medicine was the most rigorous path toward doing it. Not the only path, but the most honest one available. Chapter 3. The Bergholzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich was not a place that encouraged illusions. It was one of the largest psychiatric facilities in Central Europe, a world closed in on itself, with wards housing hundreds of patients, hallways permanently saturated with the smell of disinfectant, and something harder to name, the particular quality of human suffering that has found no exit and soaks into the walls of places where it has been present for years. The most severe patients, the schizophrenics, the manic, those who had completely lost contact with what others called reality, lived here with no realistic prospect of leaving. At a time when psychiatry had diagnoses but rarely treatments, Jung arrived in 1900 as an assistant to the director, Eugene Bleuler. The decision to go into psychiatry had surprised his medical school colleagues. Jung was an academically strong enough student to have chosen more prestigious and more lucrative specialties: surgery, internal medicine, neurology. Psychiatry was still a discipline of ambiguous standing, positioned on the uncertain border between medicine and philosophy, with a reputation that its association with asylums did nothing to help for anyone who had other options. Jung read the sentence that changed everything in the preface of a psychiatry textbook. The sentence described psychoses as diseases of the personality, not diseases of the brain, not neurological dysfunctions. Diseases of the personality, which presupposed that the personality was a real enough entity to fall ill, that there was a psyche with its own integrity that could be disturbed, fragmented, destroyed. That was exactly the question Jung had been asking since the stone in the parsonage garden. The Bergholzli demanded a form of presence that conventional medicine did not. The doctors lived in the hospital. They shared meals with the patients. The separation between the clinical world and the world of suffering that outpatient distance normally produced did not exist here. There was a daily continuity between those who treated and those who were treated that required a type of attention Jung recognized as more honest, and more useful than the protective distance. And Jung listened to his patients. He listened with an attention his colleagues found excessive, not the diagnostic attention that searches for symptoms to classify, but a narrative attention that tries to understand the system of meaning the patient is using to organize experience. The delusions of schizophrenic patients were, to mainstream psychiatry, noise, chaotic output from a disorganized mind to be suppressed as much as possible. To Jung, they were something else. There were patterns in the delusions. There were symbols that reappeared with a consistency that randomness could not produce. There were narratives fragmented, yes, distorted, yes, but narratives with an internal logic that only appeared absent to those who lacked the reference system to recognize it. Jung began building that reference system. The word association method, developed at the Bergholzli in collaboration with Franz Ricklin, was the first clinical instrument Jung constructed. The procedure was simple. The researcher said a word, and the patient responded with the first word that came to mind, while response time was measured. Slow responses, unusual responses, responses that repeated in unexpected ways, revealed areas of emotional disturbance that the patient could not or would not name directly. Jung called these clusters of disturbed responses complexes. The word exists today in every major European language as a direct legacy of that work. The method produced results solid enough that Freud, who had published The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900 and was building psychoanalytic theory in considerable isolation in Vienna, recognized in them empirical confirmation of proposals he had made from entirely different clinical material. It was the first point of contact between the two men. But before Freud, there was cousin Helly. Helene Pricework was Jung's maternal cousin and was 15 years old when Jung, still a student, began observing the seances in which she participated as a medium. Jung did not believe in the supernatural, but he recognized that something clinically interesting was happening. A young woman who, in a trance state, assumed completely different personalities, produced information she should not have had, and constructed elaborate narratives about past lives and communications with the dead. Jung's doctoral dissertation on the psychology and pathology of so-called occult phenomena, presented in 1902, analyzed the sessions with Helly with the clinical detachment of someone protecting scientific interest from personal involvement. His conclusion was that the phenomena were products of the medium's unconscious emergences of psychic contents that had no access to normal consciousness and were using the trance as an alternative channel. It was the same conclusion he would apply decades later to his own unconscious. The difference was that Helly could not control the process. Jung would learn to control his, or so he believed. Chapter 4. Today, when two intellectuals from different generations recognize each other as natural allies, there are emails, conferences, social media, proximity is immediate, and the cost of contact is zero. In 1906, there were letters. Jung sent Freud the results of the word association experiments, along with a note that was simultaneously scientific and personal, the data. Empirically confirmed proposals Freud had made from different clinical material, and Jung wanted Freud to know that there was someone in Zurich who had arrived at the same territory by an independent path. Freud replied the same day. When they met in person in Vienna in March 1907, they talked for 13 hours straight without stopping. What each man saw in the other was different enough to make the relationship inevitably unstable, but complementary enough to make it last longer than it should have, and cost more than either of them anticipated. Freud saw the intellectual son he had been looking for. Not Jewish, which mattered for the movement's survival in an academic European culture where psychoanalysis was frequently dismissed as the specific product of Viennese Jewish neurosis. Swiss, which gave the movement a geographic and cultural legitimacy that Vienna alone could not provide, and academically established at a prestigious psychiatric hospital, which gave the clinical theory and institutional foundation that Freud's private practice could not supply. Jung saw something different. He saw the only contemporary man who had arrived, by a completely different route, at the same territory he himself had been identifying since adolescence, the unconscious as the determining force of human behavior, more powerful and more encompassing than the conscious mind that believed it was in control. There was a genuine intellectual resonance between them that the letters of the period convey with a clarity that makes the later rupture both more understandable and more painful. There were also divergences that both men chose not to look at for years. Jung could not accept the absolute primacy of sexuality as the fundamental driver of the unconscious. In the delusions of schizophrenic patients at the Bergholzli, in the myths he had been studying on the margins of his clinical work, in the religions of cultures without contact with one another, there were symbols that reappeared with a cross-cultural consistency that the sexual theory could not fully accommodate. The hero who descends to the underworld and returns transformed, the great mother, the wise old man, the dragon guarding the treasure. These patterns had no sexual origin. They had an older and more encompassing origin than any individual child's experience with their specific parents. Jung kept these reservations to himself. The relationship grew. The correspondence intensified hundreds of letters over 6 years, with an intellectual and emotional intimacy that biographers identify as the adult equivalent of a father-son relationship that neither man had ever fully experienced. In 1909, they traveled together to the United States. Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, had invited Freud to deliver a series of lectures, the first formal academic recognition of psychoanalysis outside of Europe. Jung was included in the invitation. The trip lasted several weeks. The two men shared cabins on the ship, visited Niagara Falls, and analyzed each other's dreams during the crossing. It was during that trip that the break began, not as a confrontation, as one specific moment that Jung described decades later with a precision that suggests he never fully processed it. Freud had asked Jung to share a dream for analysis. Jung shared it. Freud began the analysis and reached a point where he needed additional personal information to continue. Jung hesitated. The information touched on areas he was not prepared to disclose. Then Freud said he preferred not to risk his authority by revealing details of his own personal life. Jung held on to that sentence. He never forgot it, not because it was unkind, but because it revealed, with a clarity the context made impossible to ignore, that for Freud there was a hierarchy between authority and honesty, and that when the two came into conflict, authority won. For the man who had built the most anti-authoritarian theory in the history of psychology, it was a contradiction Jung could not resolve. The voyage home from America was the beginning of the end. The appointment as president of the International Psychoanalytic Association in 1910 was simultaneously the high point of the relationship and the moment when the theoretical divergence became impossible to keep postponing. Jung had a book to write, and he knew what writing it would cost. When I wrote Transformations and Symbols of the Libido, I knew it would cost me Freud's friendship, but I had to follow my own inner vision. Jung wrote that sentence decades later, when the rupture had already been processed, or at least filed away by time. What the documents from that period show is something more complicated than the retrospective clarity of that sentence suggests. They show a man who knew the cost and paid it anyway, not with the serenity of a martyr, but with the anguish of someone who recognizes he has no alternative and understands that this does not make the loss any less real. The research that preceded the book began as clinical inquiry and became something else entirely. Jung had encountered at the Berg-Halsey a patient identified in his texts as Miss Frank Miller. In reality, an American woman whose fantasies had been published in a psychology journal, whose involuntary daydreams contained symbols that Jung recognized from mythologies she could not possibly have studied. The woman was not an academic. There was no reason for her daydreams to contain images that corresponded precisely to Greek, Hindu, and Aztec myths, and yet they did. Jung spent months working through the mythologies of cultures without contact with one another: Greek, Egyptian, Hindu, Norse, Native American, Australian. He searched for the same patterns. He found them with a consistency that coincidence could not explain. The hero who slays the dragon and frees the princess. The descent into the land of the dead and the return, transformed. The maternal figure who simultaneously nurtures and devours. The wise old man who appears at the moment of crisis, with guidance the hero did not have. These patterns were not products of specific cultures. They were productions of the human mind, emergences from a psychic substrate that preceded any culture and that every culture expressed in its own particular forms. Jung called this substrate the collective unconscious, and he called the patterns that emerged from it archetypes. These two ideas were incompatible with Freudian theory in a way that Jung had been putting off acknowledging. The Freudian unconscious was individual, the repository of each person's personal history, their repressed memories, their specific traumas, the desires that socialization had suppressed. It was formed by the lived experience of each particular individual. Jung's collective unconscious did not belong to anyone in particular. It belonged to everyone. It was the psychic inheritance of the species, the sediment of millions of years of human experience that each person was born already carrying, in the same way they were born with a liver and a nervous system without having individually constructed either. This was not a development of Freudian theory. It was an entirely different architecture. Jung wrote the book over 2 years at a pace the documents show was inversely proportional to his confidence. The further he advanced, the more clearly he saw what the advance was costing him, and the sight of that cost did not stop him but turned every page into a renewed decision. The letters with Freud during that period are documents of attention that neither man named directly, but that both recognized. Freud asked about the progress of the book with an anxiety that Jung read as pressure to confirm rather than discover. Jung responded with an evasiveness that Freud read as a sign of problems that loyalty might still resolve. Neither was wrong in how he read the other. The book was published in 2 parts, in 1911 and 1912. The reception within the psychoanalytic movement was what Jung had anticipated. It was neither immediate nor violent. It was progressive and inevitable. The way a building gives way when the foundation has been removed, not all at once, but wall by wall, until what remains is unrecognizable as what it used to be. The letters between Freud and Jung grew steadily colder. The forms of address, which had moved from formal to intimate over years, reverted to formal at a pace that measured the temperature of what was ending. In January 1913, Jung resigned the presidency of the International Psychoanalytic Association. Freud wrote to a friend that the matter was closed. Jung was left alone with what he had discovered, and with what the discovery had cost him, and he descended. The winter of 1913 was the darkest of Jung's life. Not metaphorically, though the metaphor is accurate. There was a specific quality to the months that followed the break with Freud that Jung described in his journals as the feeling of walking on ground that could give way at any moment, of the solid earth of the professional and intellectual identity he had built over 15 years having been removed, with only the unknown beneath. There were also the visions. In October 1913, an October afternoon that Jung could pinpoint with a precision suggesting the moment had been recorded. Differently from all the others, he had the first of a series of visions that were not dreams because they occurred while he was fully awake, and were not hallucinations because Jung could end them voluntarily and return to ordinary reality. He saw Europe flooded. From the north came a yellow wave that covered everything, the land, the cities, the sea. The wave carried bodies. It carried the wreckage of civilization. It turned to blood. The vision lasted in Jung's subjective experience several hours, with a detail and intensity that left him shaken for days. It repeated in December with slight variations. In August 1914, the First World War began. Jung spent years processing the relationship between the visions and what followed. The interpretation he finally arrived at was that he had accessed, without deliberately seeking it, contents of the collective unconscious that were not his individual psyche in distress, but something wider, the collective disturbance of a civilization about to destroy itself, emerging in images through a mind open enough to receive them. It was an interpretation that conventional psychiatry would classify as grandiosity. It was also, Jung would argue, the only explanation that fit the facts. But the most urgent question in 1913 was not the relationship between the visions and the war. It was what was happening to his own mind. Jung made a decision that has no parallel in the history of psychology. He decided to descend deliberately. The method was simple to describe and extraordinary to execute. He would lie on his office floor, or later sit in a chair, or walk, depending on what the interior state required. He let his mind sink. He neither guided his thoughts nor suppressed them. He observed what emerged with the attention of a clinician and the openness of an explorer, while keeping the oriented, conscious function simultaneously active. This simultaneity being inside the experience and outside it at the same time was what Jung identified as the distinction between what he was doing and what his psychotic patients experienced involuntarily. The psychotic was swallowed by the figures of the unconscious. Jung engaged them in dialogue from the position of a self that remained oriented. The figures he encountered had names. There was Elijah, the Old Testament prophet, who in Jung's descents appeared as a figure of ancestral wisdom. There was Salome, young, beautiful, blind, who Elijah introduced as his daughter and whom Jung identified as the expression of the unconscious's eroticism. And there was, more important than all the others, Philemon. Philemon had multicolored kingfisher wings, bull's horns, and a presence that Jung described as genuinely wiser than himself. This was not Jung talking to himself. It was a real dialogue with a figure that had its own perspectives, that developed lines of reasoning Jung had not anticipated, that sometimes said things Jung considered wrong and said them without caring what Jung thought about it. Jung recorded these dialogues, first in notebooks, then, progressively, in a manuscript on vellum that he illustrated by hand with images of an artistic quality that his medical training could not account for, archetypal figures, mandalas, symbols that reappeared in variations over years. the interior process taking visible form in a language that was simultaneously personal and, Jung believed, universal. This manuscript was the Liber Novus, the Red Book, which Jung kept hidden for 95 years, which his family stored in a bank vault after his death, which was finally published in 2009, and which scholars continue to debate whether it is the most important document in the history of psychology, or the most elaborate diary of a crisis that was managed but never completely resolved. Jung would say the two possibilities do not exclude each other. There is a paradox at the heart of Jung's outer life during the years of inner descent that biographers identify but rarely examine with the attention it deserves. A man who was spending his nights in dialogue with figures from his own unconscious, a winged old man, a blind young woman, a biblical prophet, was during the day an active clinician, a recognized professor, a father of 5 children, a functionally present husband, an academic who published, corresponded with colleagues across Europe, and saw patients with a regularity that nothing in his external behavior suggested was in tension with what was happening internally. This coexistence was not concealment. It was the practical demonstration of the theory he was constructing, that consciousness and the unconscious could operate simultaneously without one destroying the other. As long as consciousness maintained the orientation needed to keep from being swallowed by what the unconscious produced, Jung was proving the theory by living it. The risk was real. He acknowledged it. There were moments during the descents when the boundary between controlled dialogue and total fusion seemed thinner than was safe. There were figures that exerted a pull that required active resistance. There were contents that emerged with an intensity the everyday world could not easily absorb. The everyday world was, therefore, deliberately structured. The appointments, the family meals, the professional correspondence, and, beginning in 1923, the tower. The tower at Bollingen was Jung's answer to the need for a space that was neither his consulting room nor his family home, a place where he could be, without mediation, what the descent had revealed him to be. He bought a plot of land on the shore of Lake Zurich, in Bollingen, and began to build it with his own hands, not as a hobby, as a psychological necessity. Working with stone, the cutting, the hauling, the hand-laying of granite blocks, was for Jung a way to anchor in the physical what the interior was producing in excess. When the unconscious threatened to overwhelm him, there was stone to cut. There was real weight. There was material resistance that the dream world could not offer. The first tower was a simple circular room with a central stove, deliberately primitive, deliberately without electricity, without running water, without the instruments of modernity that the consulting room in Kuznect required. Jung cooked on a wood-burning stove, drew water from a well, and read by candlelight and oil lamp. He slept in the tower alone. Emma and the children visited occasionally. The tower was not built for them, it was built for personality number 2, the one the young Karl had first identified, sitting on the stone in the parsonage garden, the one that needed a place in the physical world corresponding to the reality it inhabited on the inside. Over decades, the tower was expanded. New rooms, a central tower, a courtyard, a private meditation space that only Jung entered. Each addition corresponded to an interior development that the stone made permanent. It was, Jung said, his psyche externalized in granite. His professional life in the 1920s was remarkably productive, in sharp contrast to the interior turbulence that had preceded it. Psychological Types, published in 1921, introduced the dimensions that the 20th century would absorb in ways Jung never anticipated, and would likely not have fully approved of. Introversion and extroversion, not as fixed personality traits, but as predominant attitudes of consciousness toward the world. The first oriented primarily inward, the second outward. The four functions, thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, as distinct modes of processing experience. The Myers-Briggs personality assessment, which decades later became the most widely used personality evaluation tool in the world, was built directly on this framework, an application that simplified Jung's model to the point of caricature but disseminated the vocabulary with an effectiveness that no academic text could have matched. Jung would have had reservations about the simplification. He used the vocabulary clinically with a nuance that HR questionnaire do not replicate. The travels of the 1920s and 1930s were another way of testing theory against reality. New Mexico in 1924, the encounter with the Pueblo Indians, whose chief told Jung that white Americans seemed crazy because they believed they thought with their heads, when everybody knew that you think with your heart. Jung held on to that. Kenya in 1925, the savannah at dawn, the feeling of witnessing the world as it had been before human consciousness transformed it into an object of analysis. An experience that confirmed his conviction that there were dimensions of the psyche that European civilization had lost and other cultures still preserved. India in 1938, where Jung deliberately refused to meet Ramana Maharshi, the most revered Hindu saint of the era. He refused because he feared the encounter would influence him in ways he could not yet evaluate. It was the caution of a map maker who does not want the territory to change him before he has finished the map. It was also, perhaps, the fear of meeting someone who had arrived at the same destination by a path that required no psychology to walk. In 1944, Jung suffered a heart attack. During the weeks he hovered between life and death, he had experiences that his doctors classified as hallucinations caused by oxygen deprivation. Jung called them something else. He described finding himself floating in space, roughly 1,000 miles above the earth. He described entering a stone temple where a Hindu in meditation was waiting for him. He described the absolute certainty that he was about to find answers that no human being had yet encountered. And then the doctor appeared, and Jung came back. He later wrote that returning was the greatest disappointment of his life. What did a man who had spent 70 years studying the human psyche see during those weeks? Chapter 8. Today, when someone talks about finding their true self, about integrating the shadow side of their personality, about becoming who they really are, they are using a language that Jung built, and that popular culture absorbed without acknowledging the source. The words circulate without the weight they carried when they were first coined. Persona, the social mask each person constructs to navigate the outer world, necessary and inevitable, but dangerous when confused with actual identity. Shadow, not simply evil, but the totality of what has been excluded from conscious identity. The repository of everything the person decided not to be, which returns projected onto others as what they hate, fear, or despise. Anima and animus, the figures of the opposite sex that inhabit each person's unconscious and determine the projections. In romantic relationships, with a persistence that only direct awareness can reduce. The self, not the conscious ego, but the center of the total psyche. The organizing principle that integrates the conscious and the unconscious into a whole greater than the sum of its parts. These words were not, for Jung, convenient metaphors. They were descriptions of real structures, as real as bones or nerves. but belonging to a territory that the instruments of physical medicine could not measure. The process of individuation, the concept Jung considered most central to his work, was the lifelong movement toward the realization of these structures, not moral perfection, not the elimination of inner conflict. Rather, the progressive integration of what had been excluded, the recognition of the shadow without being consumed by it, the dialogue with the animus or anima without being possessed by them, the gradual movement toward the self that no one ever fully reached, but toward which the movement itself was what gave life its meaning. Individuation was not a therapeutic process reserved for those who were suffering. It was the task of any human being who chose to live consciously. The 1930s were the period in which Jung developed these ideas with a depth and a complexity that his earlier writing had not reached, and in which he tested them against materials that academic psychology did not recognize as legitimate data. Alchemy was the most unexpected discovery. In 19, Jung acquired a medieval alchemical text, the Rosarium Philosophorum, which he began reading with the expectation of finding primitive proto-chemistry. What he found disturbed him enough that he spent the following years systematically working through European and Arabic alchemical literature. The alchemists were not describing chemical transformations. They were projecting onto metals and chemical processes the contents of their own unconscious, describing in symbolic language the process of individuation without knowing that was what they were doing. Calling the alchemical opus what Jung called psychological development. Calling the transmutation of lead into gold what Jung called the transformation of the unconscious psyche into integrated consciousness. It was the same journey told in another language. And it was evidence that the process Jung had discovered through the descent of 1913 was not his own invention. It was a psychological reality that human beings had been describing without knowing it. Across every era and every culture where the pressure of the interior had been strong enough to demand expression, the relationship with Tony Wolff ran through these years with a consistency that domestic life did not replicate. Tony Wolff had first come to Jung's office as a patient in 1910, young, intelligent, in crisis, following her father's death, and had emerged from the therapeutic process as an analyst, an intellectual interlocutor, and a companion in a dimension that the relationship with Emma did not cover, and that Jung could not or would not eliminate. Emma knew, she tolerated it with a generosity that biographers debate between greatness and impossible cost. There were dinners at which all three were present with a normalcy that outside observers described as unsettling, and which all three participants described, each in their own way, as the available solution to an impossibility that no alternative resolved more cleanly. Jung never held this up as a model to follow. He presented it as what it had been, the limitation of a specific man in a specific situation that theory could not resolve. Because theory does not resolve life, it only describes it with more or less honesty. Honesty was what Jung demanded of himself with a consistency that made life harder than illusion would have allowed. And it was what he would continue to demand in the years that followed, including in the years when that demand would produce the most controversial decisions of. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. In May of that same year, Carl Gustav Jung accepted the presidency of the General Medical Society for Psychotherapy. These two facts, placed in sequence, form the center of the most controversial episode in Jung's biography, the one his defenders and critics have debated with the greatest intensity and the least agreement ever since the documents from that period became fully accessible. The society had been founded in 1926 as an international organization of psychotherapists. In 1933, as Germany's professional institutions underwent rapid Nazification, the German leadership of the organization passed to Matthias Gring, a cousin of Hermann Gring, a Nazi Party member, committed to transforming psychotherapy into a discipline aligned with the regime's ideology. Jung was not a member of the Nazi Party. Jung was not German. Jung accepted the presidency of the international organization at the moment when that organization was being Nazified by its most powerful section. The question historians have been debating for decades is this: what was Jung doing? The most favorable answer, defended by biographers who knew him personally and by scholars who have examined the documents carefully, is that Jung used the presidency to restructure the organization in a way that created an international section, allowing Jewish members to maintain their professional membership even after being expelled from the German section. That at a time when the options available to Jewish psychotherapists were growing progressively narrower, maintaining an international structure with accessible membership represented real protection, even if imperfect. The less favorable answer, supported by texts Jung himself published during this period, is that Jung wrote distinctions between German psychology and Jewish psychology using the vocabulary of the era in a way that time has turned into unambiguous condemnation. That there was in those texts a complacency toward the categories of Nazi discourse that a mind of Jung's caliber could not attribute to simple political naivety. Both answers are partially true. In 1934, Jung published an article in the Zentralblatt für Psychotherapie, the organization's journal, by then under Nazi editorial direction, that drew distinctions between the Jewish unconscious and the Aryan unconscious, arguing that the psychology of Freud and Adler was the expression of a Jewish psychology that could not be universally applied. That article is the hardest text to defend in Jung's entire body of work, not because the idea of psychological differences between cultures is in itself inadmissible. Jung had spent his life arguing that different cultures produced different expressions of the same universal archetypes, but because the context of 1934 made the language of psychological differentiation between Jews and Aryans a contribution, intentional or not, to the vocabulary of dehumanization the regime was systematically constructing. Jung never expressed sympathy for the ideology of extermination. Jung never endorsed the Nuremberg laws. Jung actively helped Jewish colleagues emigrate and sustain careers outside Germany through the international structures his presidency made possible. And Jung wrote texts that used the same categories the Nazi regime was simultaneously deploying to prepare a genocide. The question biographers ask, and which remains without a fully satisfying answer, is how a man who had spent his life studying the shadow, naming the mechanisms by which people project onto others what they cannot see in themselves, failed to see his own shadow at this specific moment. The most honest answer is that the shadow operates exactly this way. It does not disappear because it has been named. It does not become harmless because it has been studied. It remains active precisely at the points of greatest blind spot, and Jung's blind spot during this period was his ambition for analytical psychology to be recognized as a universal discipline, not Jewish, not Viennese, accessible to all of humanity. That ambition was legitimate in its origin. It was the channel through which the shadow entered. In 1940, with the war fully underway and the nature of the regime indefensibly clear, Jung resigned the presidency of the organization and severed all institutional association with German structures. He continued helping Jewish refugees where he could. He continued working and he never addressed the episode publicly with the direct honesty he had applied to everything else in his life, which his critics identify as the clearest evidence that there was something he could not see, and his defenders identify as evidence that there was something he knew he could not explain without being misunderstood. The ambiguity remains. It is, perhaps, Jung's most involuntary and most honest contribution to the theory he built. The shadow spares no one, not even the person who gave it its name. Chapter 10: The Heart Attack and the Vision. I was so far away that I didn't know if I could make it back. And the strangest part, I didn't know if I wanted to. Jung wrote that sentence about the weeks of February and March 1944 with a restraint that readers identify as the opposite of dramatization, the way someone describes something too real to need emphasis. The heart attack began with a fall. In February 1944, Jung slipped on ice and fractured his foot. The forced immobility produced a pulmonary embolism. The embolism produced a myocardial infarction. Jung was hospitalized in serious condition, serious enough that the doctors offered no guarantees of recovery. Jung was 68 years old. He had spent 50 of those years studying what happened to the human psyche at the limits of experience, in the delusions of psychotic patients, in dreams, in deliberate descents into the unconscious, in the visions of the dying that patients at the Berg Halsey had described to him decades earlier. Now he himself was at the limit. What followed, during the weeks of hospitalization, were the experiences Jung described in memories, dreams, reflections with a precision that readers still do not know how to classify as the account of genuine experiences, as a later elaboration of altered states, as the inevitable mythologizing that any powerful mind applies to its own extreme experiences. The first experience began with the sensation of leaving his body. Jung described finding himself floating in space. Not the metaphorical space of a dream, actual physical space, at an altitude he later estimated at roughly 1,000 miles, with the Earth visible below, with a geographic precision that included the Indian subcontinent, the Indian Ocean, and Ceylon. In 1944, no photograph of the Earth from space yet existed. The first photographic image of Earth, seen from space, was captured in 1946 by an American test rocket. The iconic photograph most people know was taken by Apollo 17 in 1972. Jung described in 1944, with geographic accuracy, what those photographs would show decades later. Critics say the description was composed after the fact, once those photographs existed. Defenders say the journals from that period confirm the description predates the photographs. The debate continues. What Jung described next was a dark stone temple floating in space. He entered it. Inside sat a Hindu in meditation, someone Jung did not recognize but felt as familiar in the way that figures of the collective unconscious are familiar without being personal. There was a certainty, growing and absolute, that he was about to understand everything he had studied, that the questions he had pursued for 50 years were about to be answered in a way that would make them simultaneously obvious and complete. And then the doctor appeared, not in the temple, in the hospital room. Jung described seeing his physician, Dr. Hemmerle, as a figure coming from the world of the living to reclaim him, sent by the earth to bring him back before he entered fully into what he was on the verge of entering. The return was the greatest disappointment of his life. Not disappointment in the dramatic sense. In the precise sense, the return to the physical world, to the body in pain, to the hospital that smelled of disinfectant, to an ordinary reality that no longer felt real after being somewhere else. was described by Jung with the specific sadness of someone who has seen something he cannot fully describe and knows he will not see again, under the normal circumstances of existence. In the weeks that followed, while recovering, Jung had a series of nightly visions. All of them had the same quality, not of dream but of experience, not of fantasy but of perception. All of them had the quality of answer, as if the questions he had been asking throughout his life were being responded to in a language that was not verbal but was completely comprehensible while it lasted, and that resisted translation when it ended. The doctor who had treated him died a few weeks after Jung's recovery. Jung described this fact with a restraint that is neither superstition nor the denial that rationality would normally require, simply the recording of a connection between the two events that he could not name without distorting it. The texts he wrote in the years following the heart attack, in answer to Job, synchronicity, are the most speculative and the most controversial of his career. They are also the ones readers identify as the most personally honest. The texts of a man who had been close enough to the edge to stop worrying about what academia would think. He had seen what he had seen, he wrote what he had seen, and he left each reader to decide what to do with it. There is a paradox at the heart of the final act of Jung's life that the last work makes impossible to ignore. A man who had spent his life arguing that personal identity was a partial construction, that the conscious ego was an island in an unconscious ocean, that the persona was a mask over a broader and less definable reality, that the self transcended any individual story, decided, in the last years of his life, to write an autobiography. The contradiction was not naivety. It was the only form of honesty available to someone who had arrived at that point. Because if the inner life was what it was, if the dreams, the visions, the figures of the unconscious, the descents of 1913, the heart attack of 1944, were just as real as verifiable external events, then an autobiography that included only the externally verifiable events would be a deeper lie than any fiction. The collaboration with Agnella Jaffe began in 1956. Jaffe was an analyst, Jung's secretary for years, and the person who best understood what the project required, not a conventional biography, but a document that gave the inner life the same presence and dignity that the outer life normally monopolized in autobiographical narratives. The interviews took place over months. Jung talked, Jaffe recorded. The material was then reorganized, not by conventional chronology, but by the logic of what had been psychologically significant. The childhood dream before school, the stone before the university, Philemon before Freud. There were chapters Jung resisted, including, not out of modesty, out of the conviction that the internal experiences, the visions, the descents, the figures of the unconscious, were of a nature that conventional language inevitably distorted, and that, including them in an autobiography, meant risking having them read as literal when they were symbolic, or as symbolic when they were literal. Jaffe insisted. Jung gave in. And the book that resulted from that tension between resistance and concession is, for many readers, the most honest document about the inner life of an intelligent human being that the 20th century produced. Emma died in November 1955. She had married Jung in 1903, knowing that the man she was choosing was of a dimension that would make their marriage extraordinary and difficult in proportions that would likely exceed any expectation. She built her own scholarly body of work, the unfinished study of the Grail legend, completed posthumously by their daughter, which academics recognize as an independent contribution and not simply an extension of her husband's work. She endured Tony Wolfe for 40 years with a generosity that the letters show was genuine in intention and never entirely without cost. Jung described Emma's death with a brevity in his public writing that biographers identify as the restraint of someone who cannot fully speak about what he has lost. The tower at Bollingen became the place where he spent more and more of his time, not in retreat, in work. The correspondence from that period staggers archivists' letters to physicists, theologians, artists, writers, patients from decades earlier, strangers who had read the books and wrote with questions that Jung answered with an attention that made no distinction between an established academic and an anonymous reader. Wolfgang Pauli, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist who had been Jung's patient in the 1930s, and with whom he had developed one of the 20th century's most extraordinary intellectual collaborations, continued their correspondence about the relationship between quantum physics and depth psychology. Synchronicity had been developed in part through these dialogues, with Pauli seeing in quantum non-locality a possible physical basis for what Jung was describing psychologically. The last television interview was in 1959. The BBC documentary produced by John Freeman recorded Jung at 84 with a clarity of thought that commentators identified as unsettling in someone of any age. Freeman asked, near the end, "Do you believe in God?" Jung was silent for a moment, the camera preserved. Then he said he didn't need to believe. He knew. That sentence has been circulating for 60 years. It is cited by theologians and atheists alike, by Jungians and critics, by people who use it as confirmation of opposing beliefs, which suggests that the ambiguity it contains is precisely its most honest quality. Jung was not saying that God existed in the theological sense. He was saying that he had experienced something in the descents, in the heart attack, in the dreams of a lifetime, that the word God described better than any available alternative, without implying any position on the metaphysical existence of a personal being. It was the most precise answer his psychology allowed, and it was, like almost everything Jung ever said about himself, simultaneously completely true and completely open to interpretation. He died on June 6, 1961, in Küsnacht, during a storm. Those who were present described a lightning bolt that struck his favorite pine tree in the garden at the moment of his death. Jung would have said it was a meaningful coincidence. He would also have said he knew the word coincidence was not enough, and that he had no better one. Jung's influence extends into territories that official academic psychology rarely acknowledges but that are everywhere in the culture. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, the most widely used personality assessment tool in the world, administered by corporations, militaries, and schools across the globe, is built directly on Jung's psychological types. Joseph Campbell and the Hero's Journey, the mythological framework that Jung directly inspired and that George Lucas consciously used to structure Star Wars, analytical psychology as clinical practice present in Jungian institutes in 40 countries. The unresolved question remains. Jungian psychology is not science in the sense that Karl Popper defined it. It cannot be systematically falsified. It is something else, a cartography of interior experience that resonates with a cross-cultural consistency, that empirical data can neither fully confirm nor fully refute. The map exists. The territory does too. The relationship between them remains open. What Jung really was beyond the mystic his critics dismiss and the prophet his devotees venerate, was a man who had the courage to do to himself what he had learned to do with his patients, descend into the most uncomfortable territory of his own psyche and stay there long enough to draw a map. The map has errors. It has regions where speculation replaces observation. It has moments where the mapmaker's grandiosity distorted the territory he was trying to describe. It has a Nazi wound that honesty cannot erase, and that the theory he built makes all the more disturbing the more clearly it describes it. The shadow operates in everyone, including in the person who gave it its name. But no other map of the same territory exists. And the territory exists. The inner dimension of human experience that cannot be reduced to neurons and synapses, that produces dreams and myths and religions and loves and fears with a consistency that transcends cultures and centuries. This dimension lives inside every person who has ever existed. And most people spend their lives never looking at it directly. Because looking directly requires exactly what Jung demanded of himself. Descend, stay, return with what you found. The question Jung asked throughout his life was not about God or about the unconscious. It was the same question a stone in a parsonage garden had posed to a 10-year-old boy. Who is it that is here? If this video left you with an image you can't shake, a phrase, an idea, a figure, that is exactly what Jung would call a constellation of the unconscious. Something you did not consciously choose, but that chose you.